noches, muchas gracias acá. Lo siento, pero mi español no es muy bueno. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero puedo entender las preguntas. Pienso que puedo entender en español. I'm very happy to be here. It's always very difficult to talk about what is happening in the Arab world these days because so much is happening and it's happening so fast. If I was having this conversation 4 years ago, it would have been very different. Even if we're having this conversation a year ago, we would be talking about the emerging Islamist threat. And today we're already talking about the military coming back to power in Egypt and other places. So it's a very dynamic situation. And I'm hoping that maybe I'll try to give sort of an overview, a political overview of how I see things have been developing and what we've been observing on the ground. And I hope that in the questions and answers period, maybe we can dig into some of the specific situation. Okay. When we talk about the Arab Spring, I actually prefer the term Arab uprisings because Arab Spring has a certain sense of its spring and then summer. I'm not sure if we're winter or in fall right now. I prefer the term Arab uprisings. That began almost 3 years ago. It was December 2010. There was a very strong sense of elation and excitement when this was happening. I mean, the display of people power, even for those of us who've been working in the region for a very long time, was unexpected. I mean, it came as a surprise to see millions of people in the streets defying authority. And there was a hope that the change that will happen, that the Arab world and the Middle East will sort of be the next wave of democratization after what happened in Eastern Europe and in South America. Today, 3 years later, there's a lot of people who are concerned, and there's fear that the hope for change is turning into chaos and violence. In countries like Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and even Tunisia, which remains the most successful of the transitions, seem more divided than ever in many ways. And what is clear now, 3 years later, is that the people who protested, and there were many people from different segments of society, they knew what they did not want. They were fed up with the current regime. But they were not necessarily in agreement as to what they wanted. Now, I think this in itself is normal in any situation of broad social change. But what was the challenge in many of the Arab countries was that there was an absence of institutions, political parties, labor unions, trade unions, or even other institutions that could take this incredible energy and channel it in a more constructive way to sort of replace something with something else. After 40 years of dictatorship, there was an absence of institutions in most countries. The dictatorships to stay in power had sort of weakened any sort of independence of any institution, including NGOs, including political parties. I mean, these regimes started creating their own opposition political parties to say we have a pluralist political system. So, in a way, once you manage to remove the regime or put them aside, there was nothing left. Bar associations had been corrupted, labor unions had been corrupted, churches, mosques had been corrupted, the clerical establishment had been corrupted. And what made the situation even more complicated was that, unlike other parts of the world that went through periods of 40 years of dictatorship, many of the Arab countries had little experience with democracy. I mean, if we do sort of look at very recent history, the Ottoman Empire controlled most of that part of the world till 1917 until the end of World War I. Then there was a period of colonization or mandate. Then there was independence. And there was probably just around a decade of semblance of political life before the strongmen, the Saddams, the Hafiz al-Assad, the Ben Alis, and all these others came to power. So there were very few institutions in institutional history that people could fall back on to sort of renew democratic life. It had been just too short, that experience, and often very divided. In addition to the hollowing out of institutions, the fact that many of these were not functioning, the dictatorships of 40 years had sort of fostered a sense of a culture of deep suspicion between people. And there's this culture of everyone is a traitor if they don't agree with you. It's very, very strong. And I think it's part of watching one state TV for many years, which made it very hard during those early months of the transition to get to any sort of compromise, because there was a lack of trust. I mean, I work a lot on Syria, and I always joke that if you put 5 Syrian opposition members in one room for a meeting, even though they're under great threat, by the end of the meeting, 2 of them would have walked out, and the other 3 will have 4 separate opinions about what to do. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, we're seeing it now. They are unable to agree on a basic way forward, even when they are at the moment of greatest risk. And I don't think we can minimize that impact on why these transitions suddenly became a lot more complicated. Now, Islamist movements who had good organizational skills and had managed to survive the repression of the dictatorships on the margins. I mean, they had also been detained, tortured, but they had managed to thrive by focusing on charity, particularly in poor areas. So they sort of created all these networks. They managed to fill that vacuum of the early months. So after these regimes sort of put aside, the Islamists were the fastest to sort of deploy any sort of organizational skills. And they were able to seize on that momentum, and many of these Islamist movements won the first elections that happened. But at the same time, and again, if we were discussing a year and a half, we would have different perspective, but very, very quickly, frankly faster than anyone expected, these Islamists fell out of grace as well. For 2 main reasons. They did not have an agenda to govern. They just did not. I mean, how do you deal with a modern economy today? They just were not equipped for it. And I think their second weakness, as became very clear in Egypt, their instinct for survival during these 40 years had made them very suspicious of anyone who was not with them. So when they came to govern, they were not able to reach out to any of the other parties. So what you need at the beginning of a transition is often an effort to build bridges with different segments of society. They managed to alienate pretty much everyone very, very quickly. So right now, we're in the middle of a very difficult period in most countries that have undergone any form of transition. There's a lack of legitimacy for many of the current governments in place. Why? In some part because there's a constitutional vacuum. If you take, in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, all these countries are in the process of drafting a new constitution. There's no real constitution right now. So what is legitimate, what is illegitimate, and who decides is not clear. And 2, the only form of legitimacy that we could talk about would be maybe the first elections after the transition, sort of a popular democratic legitimacy. But that has also come under challenge because, as I was just saying, the Islamists were very opportunistic and they managed to win many of these elections, but not by wide margins, 50 plus 1%. But does this give you a mandate to change society? And elections, when in periods of great transition, I think societies are almost like manic depressive. One day you might vote this way, the next day you might vote completely different. And many of those who voted Islamist because they did not want to vote for symbols of the old regime. They didn't vote Islamist because they were convinced. The problem is the Islamist parties did not understand that message, and they thought they had a mandate for broad change. So when they started interfering into people's private lives, there was a strong pushback from society. So 1, there's a lack of current legitimacy for these institutions. I think 2, there's chaos, and frankly, there's worsening economic and security situation. And that's a real problem because that's destabilizing the entire endeavor. 3, there are strong tensions, as I mentioned, between Islamists and non-Islamists. But there are also very strong tensions between Islamists and Islamists, which is something that doesn't get much attention. Some Islamist parties want to be more pragmatic, and they are maybe nationalistic in outlook, in the sense that they accept the boundaries of the state and its institutions. But you have some Islamist parties that are Salafis, Jihadis. They have a very literal interpretation of the Quran. They don't want to talk about constitution. They want to say, we'll take the Quran as it is. Or some of them even don't believe in this nation state as it is. they believe in an Islamic ummah. And they consider themselves, we are the Tunisian chapter of the Muslim. They're not even agreeing to the rules of the game. And what we're seeing now is heavy clashes between these Islamist parties. And they start accusing each other, you're not a real Islamist, no, I'm a real Islamist. So very, very divided. And to complicate all of this and to make the transition even more challenging, you have competing regional interests and to a lesser extent international interests as well. I mean, the region, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, the Gulf countries are all trying to protect their interests and to carve out in that new space what is going on. Particularly between Saudi and Iran. I mean, this has been ongoing since the 80s, and now the Saudis feel they have to take their revenge on Iran because after the US invasion of Iraq, Iran's influence has expanded to Iraq. So Saudi wants to counter this, and they want to extend their influence. So they're throwing a lot of money at particular parties in different countries. Now the alignments are not necessarily what you would expect. For example, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates are big opponents, they're big enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood. Even they themselves are actually Islamists. They are big enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood because they are worried about networks of Muslim Brotherhood in their own countries. So currently, the current military regime in Egypt today is mostly financed by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates by billions of dollars to keep the Egyptian economy afloat. So there's a lot of elements of realpolitik and national interest. Now, this chaos that we're seeing now has given an opportunity to the old regime remnants to make a comeback in certain countries, and most notably in Egypt, where we see the return of security figures, which we frankly thought were going to be from the past, but also of certain security practices. And they're back with a vengeance, frankly, in the last few months. I'll just give you a recent example that illustrates a bit the current dynamic in Egypt. And Egypt is symbolically very important for the Arab world, the most populous Arab state, and sort of the idea of sort of Cairo as the biggest Arab capital city, which is in shambles right now, but just historically. There's a general called Muhammad Tuhami. He was a Mubarak figure. It will just be a quick anecdote, I won't bore you with the details, but he was very close to Mubarak, and during the Mubarak years, he was appointed to be the main general in charge of fighting corruption. Mubarak said, yes, we have a corruption problem, and he put a very close ally to this. In practice, this ally was never interested in fighting corruption. I mean, he was sort of protecting the regime interests and showing that they're doing something about it. And when President Morsi, who was from the Muslim Brotherhood, won the presidential elections, one of the first people to be fired was this general Tahami, and there was something else that happened that was interesting. Subordinate, one subordinate of this general said, actually the general is corrupt and I have evidence against him, and came forward and filed a complaint, and suddenly in the newspapers, and this was only a year and a half ago on, all the newspapers, this man is a corrupt general, we have evidence, you're going to see the trial. We thought his career is over, this guy. Well, guess what? General Tahami is back today. When Sisi, another general, they had the coup in Egypt earlier the summer, but I guess your winter in the summer in our region. One of the first moves of the new government was to reinstate General Tahani, but not to any position. They reinstated him as head of general intelligence, which is probably not the most important position, because Sisi has it, but one of the top positions in the Egyptian government. So you can imagine this man is back and he has a vengeance against those who fired him, and he's in a position to exact this vengeance. So that just gives you a sense of the current dynamic in Egypt. Now, I don't give this example to say we are going to see a return to the situation of the past. What happened in the region is a real tectonic change. I mean, this is I think it's a generational, once in a lifetime, beginning of process of change. And I think at the end, what really it's a manifestation, it's a reflection of a public recognition of the failure of the last 40 years in the Arab world, the failure of governance. This idea of the strong man, the sort of talk about, this sort of one-party rule, the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, the RNC in Tunisia, the strongman figure. These 40 years of governance have failed on every single level. I mean, economically, educationally, militarily, you name it, it's been a failure. And I think what happened 3 years ago and is continuing to happen is a rejection by society. The problem is we don't know where we're going. And there's another dynamic here which I think is very important, which is the demographics of the Arab world. The Arab world has a youth bulge right now. It's one of the youngest, in terms of percentage of population, the part of the world that has the youngest sort of youth in between 15 to 25. They're entering the job markets and there are no jobs. So in a way, it's a direct consequence of the failure of these 30, 40 years of economic policies. And that's creating a real pressure on the system. So in a way, public expectations have changed. There's a level of anger, there's a level of public empowerment, and I don't think we're going to go back to the way things were. But we are now entering a new phase in these Arab uprisings, and I don't have a neat way to summarize it. I sometimes call it Arab Uprising 3.0. If any of you sort of techies, the 1.0 was when, all of us watched the Tahrir Square, some of us went, it was very exciting, dictators were falling one after the other. 2.0 was when we realized, the Islamists are winning all the elections, and guess what, there's no Nelson Mandela that's coming up and having a hug moment where everyone is happy. The Islamist period has actually fell out of favor much faster than anyone expected, and now we're entering this new phase. It's chaotic. In this new phase, you see the old regime or the old structures trying to regain some space that they had lost in the last 2-3 years. But also you see new actors coming up, the youth, you see new efforts to organize politically. Now, how this will all end up, I think it will take years for the dust to settle. I think we're looking into at least a period of change over a decade minimum. And I think we're going to see discrepancies depending on the countries. I suspect countries like Tunisia, which is smaller, a more cohesive society, a much more educated population, managing the transition much better than a place like Egypt that has a massive military that is not willing to negotiate any of its privileges, or a place like Libya where today you have armed militias that are not, if they're not happy with something, they go and they surround the parliament until someone passes the law they like. Or Syria, which we'll talk about a bit more later, which really is in the middle of a very, very deadly armed conflict. But if we were sort of to pull back, for a second, and look at all these countries undergoing various stages of transition and problems, I think you see 3 sets of challenges that are across the region. I think will maybe speak to this part of the world as well. The issue of drafting new constitutions. And I think constitutions are important because they give the rules of the game, but also because they indicate, particularly in the Arab world, the terms of the new social contract for the coming period. And this is, right now, there's an ongoing process in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, to draft a new constitution. And in countries that haven't seen massive upheaval, like Morocco or Jordan, they've been working on some amendments now for some time. Now, there have been very heated debates about some of the same issues that occur in all these countries. The guarantees for basic freedoms, how important are these going to be? To the place of Islam in public life, very, very heated debates. The rights of women, and keep in mind, this is a part of the world that missed the whole women's rights revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s. So that debate is happening now at the same time as we're having a debate about the place of religion in public life. So it's very, very complicated. And frankly, the issue of the place of minorities and how do you manage diversity. All these debates are raging right now, and I think it's going to be very interesting how they get resolved in the coming months. The second issue, which all the countries are facing, is the role of the army and security services, and the issue of reforming the security sector. The army, but also the most feared institutions in the Arab world tend to be the intelligence services, what we call the mukhabarat, which really control so many aspects of life, but also the police. How do you rein them in? What sort of oversight? And it's particularly challenging to have these conversations, as I know Argentina, Chile, and so many other Latin American countries have these debates, at a time when politically the country is very divided, so you don't have a clear political wind to help you get over some of these hurdles. And finally, the issue of dealing with the past. Of course, the issue of justice, fighting impunity, but also something else. What do you do with past officials? And this debate is colored in the region by the experience of Iraq. After the US invasion of Iraq, the US implemented a large-scale program of de-Baathification, which was very, they basically, anyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party was kicked out of, the military, kicked out. Even if they had blood or didn't have blood, if they were corrupted or not corrupted. And that was a disaster from a management perspective, because if anyone understood Iraq, anyone who was in the public administration had to be in the Ba'ath Party to keep his job or her job. So suddenly you went from a country that had, you had Ministry of Health that had no competent officials anymore. You had an army with no officers anymore. And the whole state collapsed. So most Arab countries are aware of that and they want to avoid a repetition of that scenario. But that throws the difficult question then, who do you keep in and who cannot be kept in? Because if you keep them all in, then the old regime is going to come back very, very quickly. Well, how do you manage that transition? And this is where I think you see different countries managing that line differently. In Libya, they passed something called the political isolation law. And it's very drastic and actually quite vague and bars anyone. So anyone who ever was or served as an official in the Gaddafi administration, so basically for the last 40 years, is banned from holding public office. And this is very ironic because some of the key opposition figures to Gaddafi were former officials who maybe defected 20 years ago. But after that law was passed, the head of the current Congress and his deputy resigned because 25 years ago they were officials in the Gaddafi government and they actually went into exile. How did this law pass? Some anti-Gaddafi militias surrounded parliament and they said, you will pass this law or no one is coming out of this building. So this is very drastic. In Tunisia, they have a draft law called the Law for the Protection of the Revolution in Tunisia, which is still currently under debate. But I think it will be less drastic in the way it is perceived, and they will try to have some sort of committee that really looks at each individual separately before sort of doing this en masse firing. In Egypt, I gave you the example of the infamous general. You see that dynamic now has disappeared. I mean, all the old characters are being actually brought back from retirement to resume their work. Sorry, this is a bit of a tour d'horizon very quickly about a lot of developments and a lot of common themes. There is obviously one country that I left out that is very important, that's Syria, which is probably a country I spent 80% of my time on and that I visited many, many times, crossing illegally from Turkey into northern Syria to see what was happening. And it's hard to discuss Syria in the same basket as the other countries, because clearly what started out similarly in the sense of protest movement against dictatorship was answered with even more violence than other countries, and with the passing months turned into increasingly an armed opposition, and now we're seeing a situation of a bloody armed conflict. And as the months pass, this armed conflict is taking more sectarian undertones. I'm happy maybe to get more details on the Q&A, but just roughly speaking, we're talking now at least 120,000 people who were killed. We're talking about out of a population of 20 million to 20 to 22 million Syrians. There are now 6 million people who have been displaced. 4 million inside Syria, 2 million outside of Syria, including almost 1 million to Lebanon, where I live, which is a quarter of the population. The infrastructure of the country has collapsed in many parts. Even the health infrastructure, the World Health Organization just issued a concerned report that actually polio, which had been eradicated, is back in Syria. They found 12 cases in eastern Syria. So, efforts that have taken decades to eradicate certain diseases are actually coming back. Also, what started out, frankly, as the level of violence, the repression, the level of violence that had been used by the government has created such a situation that actually some jihadis found, a fertile terrain. So jihadis from, it's become now the new jihad land. And the fact that Assad used ballistic missiles on his cities, the fact that they used chemical weapons, the fact that they killed and tortured so many people gave at some point a terrain for some of these groups to come. So now we don't talk about opposition and government only. There are hundreds of armed opposition groups, hundreds. Many of them now fighting each other. You've got jihadis that have their own agenda that has nothing to do with the Syrian opposition at this stage. They want to establish a caliphate. You have Chechens, I've met Chechens from northern Syria. But you also have mainstream opposition groups who are fighting. But you also now have on both sides foreign fighters coming. I mean, it's a bit like the Spanish Civil War in Europe, but without the romanticism, frankly. On the government side, you've had Lebanese Shiites from Hezbollah who have joined. You've had Iraqi Shiites who have come to Syria to defend Shiite religious places. You've had Sunnis come from many Arab countries to say that we are protecting our Sunni brothers against the Assad regime. Assad comes from a minority, which is the Alawite minority, which is an offshoot of Shiism. It's also been used by Iran and Saudi to fuel their conflict. But deep down, this is a long-standing. It's a bit like Lebanon in the 70s and 80s in the sense that you have a real domestic conflict that has now become complicated by regional and even international dimensions. How this will all end, maybe we can talk about it a bit in the Q&A. I mean, frankly, I don't think anyone knows. I don't think anyone expects everyone talks about this Geneva II meeting. I don't think it's going to happen in 2013. And if it will be to happen, it will just be to please the Americans and the Russians. Nothing will be decided in the coming months, in my view. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of conclude, I think, by saying countries like Argentina, but also other big southern democracies, Brazil, India, South Africa, I think they have an important role to play during these transitions in the Arab world, and particularly in a place like Syria. I don't expect, these countries are not going to be able to project power in the Middle East, and that's not the intent. But these countries have a very rich experience going through a transition, going through, a fight against impunity, going through, different sort of thinking about how to deal with the issue of the disappeared. How do you sort of try to reform your security force? It may have been successful or unsuccessful, but there is sort of 25, 30 years of reflection in civil society, but also in certain government circles. There's also a second rich experience, I think, in Latin America, which is the role of regional institutions that played a very important role and helped, enrich the experiences and the democracy and the human rights movement in many of these countries. And I think it's very important to share this with civil society in the Arab world, and potentially in international fora, to push to be real sponsors for justice and end of impunity. For example, the experience of ending military trials in Latin America is something that the Arab world can benefit from. Or if Argentina, that played a key role in drafting the International Convention Against Enforced Disappearances, takes a leading role to revive interest in this convention in a part of the world right now where we're seeing more and more enforced disappearances. So anyway, these are sort of the remarks I want to say. Thank you very, very much.